यो जलवायु परिवर्तनको रणनीति भावी रणनीति के छ अथवा मुगु जस्तो गरिबीहरूको बसोबास भएको ठाउँमा यो रणनीति बारेमा उहाँहरू जानकार कसरी हुनुहुन्छ यो बारेमा प्रश्न पार्दिन अनुरोध गर्दछु। साथै सभासदज्यूलाई म अर्को प्रश्न गर्न चाहन्छु। प्रत्यक्ष रूपमा यो जलवायु परिवर्तनलाई असर पार्ने महिला र दलित किन भन्नु होला भने प्रत्यक्ष जङ्गलसँग सम्बन्धित महिलाहरू हुन्छन्, दलितहरू हुन्छन् र उहाँहरूको पहुँचको लागि, उहाँहरूको समावेशीको लागि, उहाँहरूमा चेतना वृद्धिको लागि उहाँ सभासदज्यूले अबको आउने संविधान सभामा अथवा संविधानमा के को बारेमा अथवा महिलाको बारेमा के कस्ता कुराहरू उहाँले राखिदिन सक्नुहुन्छ यो बारेमा उहाँले प्रश्न पारिदिनु भए अझै म आभारी हुनेछु। हस्, धन्यवाद। यो जलवायु परिवर्तनको रणनीति भावी रणनीति के छ अथवा मुगु जस्तो गरिब
Right, so Anne, I believed you created a similar program in Uganda. Perhaps you could explain to us exactly what you did.
Thank you so much.
No, straight off. Was on. Okay.
Thank you so much. I come from, I represent in this forum the frontline people who are faced with disaster every day. And I also represent the global network of local actors at the community level. And our focus is really to see to it that the local voices get to be heard. It's usually very difficult to have civil society get the attention of media on everyday things because it sounds very boring and it doesn't sell as news. But what we did in Uganda was to create a mechanism which we called the People's Parliament. And the People's Parliament is actually a pseudo parliament. It has a speaker, it has a clerk to council, it has ministers, but at community level. And we use that as a strategy to empower communities to interrogate issues of service delivery, issues of climate change, issues of disaster risk reduction. And we saw really critical issues coming up. We also noticed that discussion takes place at the national level and there is limited connection between what is taking place at the community and policy level. So we now requested for partnership with the National Media House, TV station, and requested them that we have an interesting program, would like you to partner with us in airing. So what happened is that we co-partnered. Their role was to mobilize the policy makers, the members of parliamentarians. Ours was to organize the community to speak. And we brought all of them to one space. And it would run just like a parliament, a people's parliament.
Thank you, Anne. So that's a really interesting mechanism for risk governance. I mean, it is a nationally broadcast program, correct? What were some of the challenges you had in getting the broadcasters to partner with you? Because I imagine it wasn't that simple. What were the arguments you made?
The first argument we made is that this is new. It's the first time that local voices can be seen at national level. So we told them it's one thing that can market the station, and secondly, because it would bring local people actually engaging with their politicians, their parliamentarians, and that sounded quite interesting. And then the other thing that made us sell is that the fact that communities were actually organizing and speaking as parliamentarians drew the attention of the media house. And when we aired the first one, it drew a lot of attention from the politicians. The next time we invited them, nobody would want to miss because the communities would ask you very hard questions, and if you're not there, you had to be account to the community.
Okay, so you kind of got some kind of critical mass in terms of viewing audiences, and therefore the parliamentarians had to appear. Yes, okay. Very interesting. Jack, I know that you provided key input into a recent OECD report on risk communication and trends and good practice. But I think you were looking at a slightly different area, less at the communities, but more about how industry, the private sector, should work with public agencies around this issue of complex risk. So where did risk communication figure in that? What were some of your key findings?
Well, at the OECD, our responsibility is to provide policy advice to governments, and so first we do in our research is find out what they're doing, and then trying to find out what they're doing well, what they're not doing so well. Our survey first asked who has responsibility for risk communication in governments, and luckily there's a well-assigned governance structure in our OECD countries for this, but we find the governments are taking action mostly through local level, through mayor's offices and such. There's not a formally assigned responsibility to the private sector in most OECD countries, and this is going on informally, but less than 50% in the private sector, 50% of the countries have a private sector formal role in risk communication, and that figure goes down to less than 10% when we talk about media having a formal role in risk communication. Or in the private sector, what we see is the operators of critical infrastructure protection. For example, in Europe, you have the Seviso operators. These are industrial actors that have activities that can possibly put the public surrounding it at risk. So there is, of course, it's a formal responsibility for risk communication there, but a lot of work to be done in trying to involve a broader base of the private sector in risk communication.
That's very interesting, Jack. So it seems as if in a lot of countries, the media itself are not formal partners in the risk communication system, unlike the critical infrastructure operators, such as the energy and the water utilities, I suspect. Yeah.
Mostly, it's of course in chemicals. The chemical plants is where the regulation comes into play.
Okay. I'd love to open this up now to the audience. So, on this issue of risk governance, how do we actually engage with the media more effectively? Is it a problem, do you think, that actually in many countries they're not even part of the formal risk communication system? Inviting questions, comments. Okay, a hand's just gone up there at the back. Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Yes, my name's Tom Roach, I'm from FM Global. I just wanted to ask about the fact that risk has such a negative connotation, and thinking about industrial locations or private sector, people don't want to talk about risk so much from that sector because it has such negative connotations. How do you see that we can get over that? So VESO is really aimed at sort of some bad things have happened, so we put the onus on some of those actors to actually go and tell people there are risks and they have to communicate that locally. There are similar risks from other industrial sectors, but we don't put the same onus on them. But risk is so negative, people don't really want to speak about it. How do we bridge that gap? How do you see that can be done? Is it legislation that needs to do that? Or is it corporate governance that needs to drive that?
Yeah. Is it legislation? Is it corporate governance? Is it opening up data so that actually you have open data channels that allow more actors to do the risk analysis and identify where the hazardous plants are? Be interested in some feedback, perhaps from Deco first of all.
So I cannot speak on the governance, but what I can speak on is what people can do. So when I think of risk, I kind of see it as it can be empowering. But it's giving you an active role. Okay. So when we talk about risk communication, it's what can I do? So kind of how to make that less negative. One way could be to have an active role for participants in the messages. So what can they do? Now, it's not necessarily like the infrastructure things we think of, like things you can do to your home, but just little small things that people can do to make themselves less at risk at that moment in time.
Okay, a comment from Jack on this issue of regulation versus really, I think, companies viewing this as part of their corporate social responsibility versus leaving this maybe to the data and information marketplace to ferret this stuff out and put it up into the ether. Where do you stand on that?
certainly regulation is one way to go, and we've seen that it's been effective with these plants that are subject to, for example, civil regulation. On the other hand, governments can take a softer approach, which is to frame these risks as a whole society responsibility. And it's a type of narrative that we haven't heard for a very long time, but now most of the risk managers in government are buying into this type of narrative, it's a shared responsibility. And so I think that softer approach that engages private sector, households, that sees it as a safety or security as a public good, that everyone has a role to promote and to foster.
Thank you. Thanks, Jack. I think there was another question in the middle of the room. There's certainly one at the back, again from Jano. Did I miss a hand? Oh, I missed a hand.
Hi, thank you. I want to try to broach kind of a sensitive area, which is how do you as members of the media contend with situations where some kinds of information the government may not care to have covered. For example, I think it's long enough now that we can say after Hurricane Ivan in the Caymans, there was a media ban talking about the impacts. There was concern that investors would fly away and never come back. In a West African country in which I work, the media is not allowed to cover serious flooding because there was another major event going on in the country, and the government felt that they were doing the best they could to prevent a terrorism attack, and they did not want the distraction of coverage about a few thousand people flooded out of their homes. So I just wanted to open this kind of, ethical dilemma. I don't expect you to have pat answers, but I'd be very interested to hear how you find your moral courage in these kinds of situations.
Lisa, would you like to feedback on that?
Clarify, I'm not with news, so this statement isn't coming from news. I'm not sure that problem applies only to disaster risk reduction. I think that comes down to governance and accountability. And we know the role that we want to see media play in those situations. We want them to play the role of watchdog, trying to open up that conversation with government, holding them to account. And I think that we need to address issues of risk as strongly as we do in other areas of governance as well.
Thank you, Lisa. Jack?
Thank you. I completely agree that there's a question there about holding governments to account, but when we talk about bringing in a broader group of stakeholders into messaging to the public about risks, we have to hold them to account as well. I think about, all of us should think about the misperception of risk during the time of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in many of the countries that I work with. The messaging that's coming to our publics, not necessarily from the government, but through NGOs in our countries who have a right to speak. But if they're going to create a misperception of the risk, then governments need to act to correct it.
Yes, I think they do. But maybe there's also a kind of a disconnect between the vulnerability and resilience indexing and the big studies that occur. There is no linkage with the media freedom indexes. And actually, if a country cannot publish its hazard maps to its local media, right, then actually, arguably, that country is a risk in investing in, and the infrastructure investments that are actually being encouraged and matched with vulnerability and resilience indexes have something missing, really. So perhaps if we could bring those indexes together, maybe that's something for the OECD to do, we might actually, I think, start to unravel some of this kind of dysfunction that Jano referred to. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Gentleman in front in the blue shirt. Okay.
I'm Lee Gregory. I'm from IOM in Timor-Leste. I'm not talking about Timor-Leste. I'm actually from Darwin in Australia, and Darwin's pretty well known because in 1974, 90% of the city was flattened by a cyclone on Christmas Eve. It's called Cyclone Tracy. And the interesting thing about Darwin is that we're talking about a sort of that risk isn't sexy, etc. What actually happens in Darwin every year is that there's actually a commemoration of Cyclone Tracy. And one of the most effective things to ensure preparedness are the anecdotal, recall of what happened to people in the cyclone and how they actually survived. And what that's actually done in Darwin is it means that it's very, very real. Even though it was a long time ago, it's very, very real, and the media gets on board, and every cyclone season they publish a supplement and they rehash the accounts of how people survived, etc. And I would probably say 70% of the population have a cyclone kit during the cyclone season, and it seems the government, the media, everyone gets on board. So I think those sort of anecdotal accounts of how people survived a cyclone or a flood or a bushfire, I think that they're very, very effective in providing it's a very, very sort of realistic context of what a flood's like. I guess in somewhere like San Francisco, it's a while since they had 1906, I think it was, since they had a pretty bad one. So anyway, that's just my comment. Thanks. It's less of a question, more of a comment.
And what are the factors that keep that historical memory alive of the Cyclone Tracy? I mean, who comes together to keep that, and do the media play a role in that?
I think it is those comments and accounts of people that were very, very young, and they may have been 5 or 6, and they're interviewed and they recall how they hid in the bathroom, in the bathtub, and the whole house blew away except the bathroom,
which is the safest room in the house in a cyclone. So I think it is that continuation of that fact, and the fact that Darwin, it hasn't had a bad cyclone, but every year there's cyclones that sort of skirt around, or the odd category 1 or whatever. So it's the fact that the hazard seems to be ever present. So people can't be complacent because they see that there are cyclones coming past, tracking past all the time. Anyway.
Maybe more of a challenge with something like an earthquake, where often nothing happens for a number of years and the memory gets lost. Yeah. So, more questions. Gentleman in the brown jacket.
Kind of a follow-up question to this gentleman's comment is we know that whether it's an individual, whether it's a corporation, again, there are individuals in the corporation that make the decisions for the corporation, and whether it's individuals in a government making decisions for the government, when you when you get some information and you have a very short time to react to it, there's a bias that you will probably follow the lead of somebody else that has just as little information as you do. It's called herding. Or you say, what did they do in such and such a place? Can we do the same thing? Does media have a role in educating people that, listen, you will have biases. If you leave it to the last minute to make a decision, you will have biases, and the decisions probably won't be the most prudent ones.
Right.
Thank you.
Yes, a corrective influence. Can the media play that role?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, basically, because I think the ability to make decisions is critical. I think that we need to take, in this sector, we need to take a big step away from messaging, telling people what to do, and instead providing people with lots of information and helping them to make decisions. And I think flagging some of that bias is important to help them realize that may be happening. One thing that we did in Tanzania, we ran a radio program around farming for rural farmers in partnership with a local radio station, and we knew that decision making was critical. Climate change presents a lot of unpredictability. Should the farmers be planting these seeds or these? When? How do they make those decisions? And what the radio presenters did was they role modeled decision making when they had those conversations with experts. So they invited experts